All right, so my very first big girl speech language pathologist position, I was hired on as an SLP at an ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis Center for Children with Autism. These kids were 2 years old, maybe a little bit younger, but 2 years old to 5 years old. And they came to our center-based program every day, all day. It was kind of like a daycare. These kids were dropped off and then picked up at the end of the day. They had behavioral therapy throughout their entire day, and then they started seeing me for speech therapy. And really, these children were aged out at 5 because of insurance reasons. Insurance no longer paid for ABA services beyond 5 years old. So after 5, these kids went on to kindergarten, some sort of schooling, but they no longer continued with us in the ABA center. This was my CF year as well. I should say that I was hired on part-time at first, and then as enrollment increased, then my hours increased eventually to full-time hours. As I said, I mostly worked with ages 2 to 5. Professionally, I was working with behavior therapists, BCBAs, occasionally psychologists who did our diagnosing, but primarily I worked with the behavior therapists, the BTs. Paperwork wise, I would do yearly evaluations. We use the PLS primarily, and that qualified our children only and primarily because of their initial diagnosis of autism. At the time, we did not consider, I guess we considered, but we considered other languages, but we did not test in other languages at that time, but we did mention it in our reporting if there was a second language or a third language. But primarily these children qualified under their autism diagnosis. I would do 3-month progress notes. So every 3 months I would write another report outlining the progress, updating goals, changing things as needed, and this would go home to parents. Daily I would write a SOAP note. We didn't have electronic systems back then. We would just write everything handwritten. That was our protocol. Just a quick little SOAP note, taking data, and that would be returned in monthly to our billing department. I was in charge of printing, faxing all of my reports and sending those out to doctors, keeping track of doctor's signatures, which never came back on time, of course. So then I was calling doctor's offices and following up and calling, and that took a lot of my time, just tracking down these signatures. That was not something I was prepared for in grad school, but that was part of my position there. Meetings were pretty minimal. We did not have sit-down meetings with parents. At least I was not included in those. The behavior therapists met with parents a lot. I was occasionally included, but they didn't have a lot of meetings back then. My therapy was one-on-one with children. I saw them 30 minutes, 2 times a week. And again, the kids kind of came in and it was, here's their behavioral therapy all day long, and then they'd come to me for speech. And their behavior therapist would bring the children to me, pick them up, and then go back out into their daily programming. We were pretty heavily based on language therapy because a lot of these kids were not talking. They were not communicating effectively. They were crying, reaching for things. They didn't have words. So we were really starting at the baseline with communication skills and working our way up the hierarchy to more functional ways of communication, especially for these young ones, especially for the ones that are very, just brand new to therapy in general. So that's what we were working on. We didn't do a lot of articulation because a lot of these children were not appropriate for articulation at that time. Again, they were young and then new talkers, so it was not appropriate. Something I learned very quickly with the ABA program that I did not learn in grad school was really how to break down all of these large goals into small little step-by-step goals and step-by-step processes, starting at that baseline or what felt like below the baseline sometimes, and really work slowly and patiently to get up to our final goal. And that was something that the behavior therapists really taught me, and I understood and grasped onto that. Something that we did that kind of felt funny is we did talk tools, the horns, the whistles, the bubbles. That was something that the owner had purchased, and so that was required. Everybody did whistles and horns and bubbles, And I get the idea of kind of that cause and effect. If I blow on this bubble, something happens, just that airflow. But we know that oromotor exercises without sound is not the best connection or way to increase communication or articulation. But that was something that was required of everybody, is something that we did. Eventually I kind of grew a little bit more confident in my therapy, and I thought, you know, this is not the best strategy. So I started taking more control and realizing who was appropriate for maybe that and who wasn't, and kind of branching out and doing my own thing. But that was something that I saw at the clinic. We did feeding therapy, but we were not trained, I would say, appropriately oromotor wise for feeding therapy. We watched the Talk Tools videos, the DVDs, but I don't feel that it really prepared us as a whole to be doing oromotor based feeding therapy at the time. So instead, our therapy looked more behavioral, more sensory. We kind of followed that ABA approach of first take a bite of this, then you get that. And that was the behavioral portion of it. It wasn't necessarily oromotor. Now that I look back and know more about that, it was not, I guess, up to my standards that I know now. The expectations of a speech language pathologist in an ABA center was that I would follow those ABA principles and protocols. These children were getting ABA all day long. They came to me for speech. They kind of expected that ABA in my speech therapy. And I would use a lot of it, but again, I kind of was a little more lax on some of the ABA as I grew more confident as a therapist. But I also used a lot of the methods just to increase my teaching and my understanding with the children. I loved the errorless teaching methods, which is, you know, when you, you label, you know, what is it? And they don't answer. What is it? And then you give the model. Pumpkin, what is it? And kind of fade out your cues. Just errorless teaching methods are preparing children for labeling or responding accurately and giving them those responses. That's something I continue to use to this day. It makes sense for me. Breaking down goals into smaller parts made sense for me, and that's something I learned working in an ABA center. Something else that I appreciated or understood was just the behavioral component. I use a different sort of lens working there, like understanding behaviors. You know, why is a child screaming or flopping on the floor or running away? Are they seeking my attention? Are they escaping the work or escaping the sensory something? Like, what is the why behind the behavior? And it really got me thinking as a therapist more about that why and what happened prior to the demand. And now what's the behavior? And now what can I do to bring that child back either to the table or back to the lesson, by understanding the reasons behind behaviors. Collaboration at first at my center was not like there was no collaboration. It was like, here's BT world over here, here's speech over here. Don't combine. It can be a great combination. It can also be a very large divide. I had to really reach out to my behavior therapist and invite them into my sessions so they could kind of understand the speech world and see what their children were working on in ways I'm prompting things that was different than what they were doing in their programming as a behavior therapist. I did have to educate, and that's our job, is to educate others on the developmental standards for words, articulation. I remember there was a 2-year-old little boy and the BTs were drilling, slide, slide, say slide, before he went on the slide. And I had to just stop and say, you know, that SL, those blends, like that's not that appropriate of a word for him right now, especially as a new talker. He has a second language. Why don't you try go? Why don't you try and give some suggestions? But that was something that I had to kind of branch out and educate. It was helpful because I would have behavior therapists come into my session and coach me through behaviors. I had a little girl who would scratch my legs and watch my reaction, and everything I tried was not working. So she would sit in the corner, the behavior therapist, and coach me through of what to do, what to say, and eventually those behaviors were eliminated because of that help.